We know, all of us, that the best children's books, even picture books, which people think might just be written for little children, but the very best picture books by Quentin Blake or Where the Wild Things Are, or, you know, extraordinary stories which are told are for everyone. And a parent and a grandparent sitting reading one of these stories to a kid loves them. You love the pictures, you love the story, because they're just terrific tales for everyone. I don't care whether you're 3 or whether you're 93. I want to avoid writing a story about the First World War which was from one side or the other. It was important to me, and right from the outset, to write a story which was, if you like, a look at the universal suffering of that war and any war. Somehow through the eyes of all the combatants, through the people over whose land it was being fought, and of course of the creatures that were also being used, in this case the horses, to help fight this war. And it's bound, starting in England, which I knew it would start from this village in Devon. It would be an English perspective. So I thought, well, no, write it in the first person, be the horse. Now, I know this has been done before in Black Beauty, and it's been done often. And it doesn't really work very well with animals, it seems to me. It's the kind of thing that certainly most grown-up people think, oh, for goodness sake, horses don't think like that, you know, mice don't think like that, don't do it, don't play that game, don't go there. But I thought, well, it's worth a try, because if I get the voice right, then I really can get close to the life of that farming family in Devon through his eyes. I can get close to the soldiers who buy him, to his training. I can get close to the Germans who capture him, to the farm in France where he was looked after. I can follow him all the way through his story, and at the same time have some kind of vision of this shattered world that he was living in, and what people were doing to one another. And if I got it right, I thought, wouldn't that be the best way of telling it?
Squad, by the left, quick, march, left, right, squad.
So there's an accent at the beginning of the inbred. Well, it started quite some years ago when we brought Faustus in Africa to the Battersea Arts Centre when Tom Morris was artistic director there, and he saw a hyena in that play, which he fell in love with.
When they're working with puppeteers, the first thing that they teach them is to make the puppet breathe. That's the first step. So any handspring puppet in any show, even if it's not active in a scene, is breathing, and that's part of the magic of their work.
Then he came to look at our giraffe play in Cape Town, which we did about a giraffe that was given to the King of France in the early 19th century, and he was intrigued by that. It was a full-size giraffe.
And there were all sorts of things with the show that didn't quite work, but whenever the giraffe came on stage, it was doing this thing, it was breathing, and the audience immediately warmed to it.
And some months later, he mentioned Warhorse on the phone. The thing that intrigued me most, a horse going into war and seeing a war through the eyes of an animal, which is a neutral character, and forms bonds with the people or the other animals that come into its life. So the neutrality of the animal, the way it didn't make judgments about any situation, was what appealed to me. Plus the love story of the boy finding his horse again, that I knew was a winner.
Just step and go. Okay, yeah. On any one step that you fancy.
We were completely able to dedicate ourselves to the puppetry and not have to worry about poster design or actors' contracts or anything.
The first workshop we came to was when the project was still very much a question mark, and we were realizing that there were difficulties in adapting a novel about the war to the stage.
We could have pulled this at any moment. The National Theatre Studio, which is where we test and develop the kinds of ideas that Warhorse was, gives us an insurance policy. We can see whether it's working. We can take it up to the brink, and if it feels like it's going to be a disaster, we can pull it and nobody needs to know anything about it.
So for a week, we did exactly that. Basil and Adrian came from South Africa with a pair of scissors and some cardboard, and I invited a team of actors who I was used to working with and who were good at improvising. And we began to play around with little bits of the story. I remember there was a critical moment where I asked an actor called Ed Woodall to pretend to be a horse, not to speak, and another actor called Sam Barnett, who's the one who can sing in the History Boys, to play a boy. And Sam Barnett had a halter, a bit of rope, and I said to Sam, okay, you need to try and calm the horse down, played by Ed, until it will accept the halter on his face. And I said to Ed, don't accept the halter until the boys calmed you down. This can go on all day if you like, but just play it for real. And they improvised it, and really with no dialogue at all apart from, good boy, good boy. They created this extraordinary scene. Basil and Adrian were watching, and so we discovered two things there. We discovered that creating a realistic characterization of an animal in an absurd fashion, in that case by having a man pretending to be a horse, was a good building block for a compelling piece of drama, even if it wasn't led by the dialogue in the scene.
But we did need to try out whether the Olivia was good for the horses, and we'd made some paper mock-ups of horse heads and tails out of shredded newspaper and cardboard. And they were kind of like hats that you wore on your head, and several of the workshop participants were released onto the completely bare Olivia stage one afternoon and pranced around. And from up on the gallery, the stage looked absolutely ideal.
I was really attracted to it from the off, I suppose, because it obviously had to be an epic show, really vast, stretching a huge amount of time and encompassing the First World War. Productions are workshopped all the time that don't make the stage, and I think that's really important that that's allowed to happen. I think as a creative working on something, it's really wonderful to not think about the end result sometimes.
I still wondered how on earth you could make a play around puppets, because puppets were clearly, and they explained this, we weren't going to be telling a story, they said, from the point of view of the horse. It would be the puppets who would be centre stage and everything would be going on around them. I went up to a workshop, and Basil and Adrian were over again from South Africa, and by this time they had made this, a maquette of Joey. And we all sat around, and by this time Marianne Elliott was there, and Ray Smith, and Basil and Adrian were explaining how the head would work and how the legs would work, and we all sat there saying yes and good Lord and all the rest of it. Again, you know, you have to suspend disbelief. When you see this and think it's going to occupy centre stage on the Olivia, you think, fine, but show me.
So it was absolutely essential to see that there was going to be a puppet that was worth spending 2.5 hours with. So when I saw the prototype Joey at the studio, it certainly felt worthwhile to go on and commission a play.
Next launch, Hunter Coach, half thoroughbred, half draft. Draft mother and a night of passion with a thoroughbred. Just like mine did. He looks like he might have a bit of speed when he gets older, so who stopped me off, eh?
The nature of the show is that it's poor theatre, which means that it's not about illusion. You don't have to believe in the illusion quite so much. You're aware of how it's made, so you're aware that they're sticks of wood, but the sticks of wood become a foal to you. And a thrust theatre helps that because you're not behind a picture frame. So you're allowing the audience into how something is made a bit more.
But in the first workshop with the prototype horse, it became very clear that we couldn't only have head movement when the horse was still. And so we developed the neck pole. Because there's somebody working it externally, they've got quite a lot of levers to add expression to the head.
And we kind of were really worried that person would be seen to be kind of an attendant of the horse and part of the image of the production. But in fact, we were amazed to realize that they quickly disappeared for the audience, and the audience was able to discount them entirely.
That it relaxes. Down. Yeah, that's it. Down. Whoop. Down. Whoop.
The hardest thing actually was to create the weight of a horse, just anatomically, so that the puppeteers could, through their movement, realize the horse's weight and actually manipulate the legs so that the horse, when it moved forward, you could see the muscles of the weight of the horse, because you know how much a horse weighs, or you know how it moves. It's an incredibly powerful animal, so we have to be able to see the muscle structure as the horse moves. So we work out the walk of a horse, you know, which has a certain rhythm. There's a certain point where the horse has to pick up a step, otherwise it doesn't look right.
So the horse kind of does a walk pattern, which is 4 time. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 with the back legs, and then it will pass into a trot, which is 2 time. So the front left is moving at the same time as the back right, and the front right is going at the same time as the back left, and that will be a 2 time. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then there's a gallop. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there's a canter, which is 3 time, but we haven't been able to achieve that. Something to do with 3 people and a horse.
So I would slowly start with the puppeteers, with Adrian and Basil, literally finessing little tiny moments. And what happens as well is that a major thing is to introduce the levels of tension, which becomes particularly important in order to put through the puppeteers the levels of tension in the horse.
There were 2 seeds, really, from which the story of Warhorse grew. The first was some pictures, which my late father-in-law left to Claire, my wife. And the subject was British cavalry charging up a hill into barbed wire, and there was a wood behind, and it was a snowy scene, and there were Germans shooting at this cavalry charging towards them. And the reason it was terrible, apart from the fact that war is always terrible, was that the horses had already become entangled with the wire. And I'd done a little research. And the research I'd done, by ringing up the Imperial War Museum, that's all, was simply to ask how many horses had gone from this country in the First World War, and how many horses were killed. And they came back with the answer, we think, but we're not sure, between 1 and 2 million. And that was just on our side. So I had that in my head. And then one day I came up and I was sitting here in this pub by the fire. And sitting opposite me was an old bloke who I'd known and I'd seen around. He wasn't a particular friend, but I knew because I'd been told that he'd been to the First World War. And so I asked him, by way of making conversation, no more, what regiment were you with? And he said, I was with the Devon Yeomanry, he said. I was there with horses. I started asking him about how that was. He was 17 years old, and he left this tiny little village. The first time he'd really been beyond the parish almost, except a market. He found himself in northern France with horses as a soldier.
But one of the things that you need to do when you put the puppet on is just check, is it working right? That's not working very well. So twist it around and suddenly you've released that.
A rod puppet is a direct controlled figure. It's controlled by rods attached to various important elements of the structure, and you have your hand, a rod, and the puppet, so you have a direct, rigid control. A string control is a much more fluid device, and therefore less easy to control, less easy to be dynamic.
String puppets are more poetic, they're more dreamy. They're good at flying, for instance, but they're not so good at passing things or interacting forcefully between characters.
Because they're both sculptors by training, the objects that they make are quite beautiful on their own. They sustain your attention without doing very much. So it allows the puppeteers to do very little and to invite the audience onto stage in their imaginations and to focus in on very small, very subtle things. And even in Warhorse in a big theatre, the most delightful moments for me are the ones when you know that 1,000 people are looking at the movement of a tail or a single ear turning.
It's really important for us to find moments where everything is still on stage enough for us to see the ears and the tail move. Tail is fairly easy, but the ears sometimes you've got to plan those moments really carefully so that the audience actually can see them. And if there's a lot of movement noise happening on stage, then you won't see them.
The third important element are the eyes. They don't move at all, but they have been constructed with a depth so that they feel like dark pools. And the audience focuses on the eyes immediately because they have a kind of a glass and they're dark and they pick up the theatre lights. They allow you into the head of the horse.
You've got to be able to breathe for the object and breathe with the object. And very often you're working as a team. And the only way that you can really communicate with other people who are operating together with you on the same object is through breath. You know, you've got one person standing in the back who operates the back, legs and tail. You've got the chap who stands inside the body of the puppet that operates the front legs. And we refer to him as the heart. And then there's somebody that operates the head who is completely visible and stands outside the puppet body and is in control of the ears and the neck movement and the head movement. And we were always told by the directors, Tom and Marianne, that the horses need to be horses. They're not supposed to be well-behaved. They must always remain animals. And animals are unpredictable.
Interesting just seeing the different horse teams. The original Top Form team talked quite a lot and had a lot of cues and a lot of signals within their puppet. You know, ear swishes, tails, things, they kind of pass the ball to each other, which is what we called it, where all the three puppeteers don't operate their bits of the horse at the same time. Otherwise you're loading the audience with information and they don't know where to look or what the horse is feeling. So a lot of it became about kind of doing less.
And there's an added complication with the horses because you can't see what everyone else is doing. You're strapped into this structure, so I can't see what my back legs are doing. And if the head goes above a certain height, I can't really see what the head's doing either. So we've found various techniques. There are things like, because I'm physically strapped into the guy behind me, if I move slightly to the left or to the right, he can feel that. And the more we get used to each other's way of moving, the easier it is to sort of indicate, oh, I want to do this now, or you know, someone else can start that movement and move in another way. If there are big sort of complicated moves to do that are fast or dangerous, we have a series of calls that we use to each other. So we'll use blows that sound maybe a little bit like something the horse might do anyway, but that we can recognise as not just vocalising to make the horse seem realistic, but as a signal that we're about to do something. So if we're about to run off, for instance, really fast, you might go, and then everyone else can just hear that little noise, and off we go.
The crows, the goose and the foal, and the soldier puppets. The puppeteer is equally visible to the audience as the puppet, sometimes more so. Frequently they're much bigger than the puppet itself. So, and the goose is just a great example of that. Finn Caldwell and Al Najari, who work the goose, find slightly different ways of working the goose when they're performing. But there's an amazing concentration of the puppeteer's physicality, and his focus feeds totally down this long rod towards the goose puppet.
When you come out with some wood that's made into a certain shape, and you're implying to the audience, I'm going to play a game with you. Do you want to play back? And if they stay and they watch, then they say they're playing back. They're playing back. They're agreeing to play this game. And it's like playing with toys, and I think it invites adults to go, wow, I can be open to this. It's like I'm a child again, and I think that's why they have such strong emotional reaction to the show.
It became really difficult in the beginning because the tendency as an actor or performer is to listen to the dialogue. Now, an animal doesn't necessarily understand English. And certainly horses, we know, have a very specific language of their own, which we had to learn. But the only way I could really access the mind of a horse is to stop listening to the text, stop listening to the dialogue, and start to kind of gauge the kind of temperature of a scene or the levels of anxiety that the humans around us were working on. So, for example, in the stable scene in the very beginning of the play, you've got Albert, who gets really, really upset because his father's trying to sell the horse. And all I would do is I wouldn't actually listen to the words he was saying, but I would listen to his levels of anxiety, and as his levels would rise, that's how I would react. I would know that there was a problem. And as he calmed down, I would calm down.
It's all right. It's all right. Good boy. Good boy. Working with the horse puppets, in preparation, before I even met the Joey and Topthorn, before I met the puppets themselves in action, I went and spent a lot of time with real horses, thinking that I have to project a lot of what a real horse is onto the puppet. But actually, when I walked into the room for the first time and met Joey as a moving, living horse, it's very easy, actually, to believe that it is a horse without having to project anything upon it. There's not much acting required in that area, because it's so instinctive and in the moment and breathing and living that there's not much actor's imagination required. Joey boy, when I call Joey like that, you'll always know it's me, Albert. That's a good start, Joey. That's a good start, boy.
And his horse, it stood down in yonder shade. It was down in yonder shade. He went whistling to plough. And by chance there he met a pretty maid. Pretty maid. By chance there he met a pretty maid. And oftentimes they wandered into that yonder glade, and contented they lay amidst the shade, and the sweet bells did ring, and the nightingale did sing, all for the ploughboy and his tender maid, all for the ploughboy and his tender maid.
What's extraordinary about the adaptation is that on paper, when I read it, I thought an awful lot of it didn't work. Well, why did I think that? Partly because it was different from what I'd written, I'm sure, being a vain old thing. But secondly, because I don't think I understood the craft of playmaking at all. And I had to be persuaded about a lot of it. Now, there are certain humorous moments which I think are utterly brilliant and I couldn't have written in a million years. But it looks awful on paper. I'll give you an example. These Tommies are often trying out French words at each other. Bon is the great thing, you know. You know, you're a bon boy and a bon mother and all the rest of it. And you read that in the paper, you think, oh, for goodness sake.
After me, just squeeze.
Put it in an actor's voice, and the actor doing what the actor does, which is to say it with extraordinary commitment, and it's terrific, and it really works.
So, alongside the story of a boy and a horse, there's a story of a village that goes to war, a community. And in order to convey the reality of that community quickly, I was always interested in using song and using particularly folk song within the musical language of the piece.
In the workshops I was introduced to John Tams, the folk singer and the song maker for the project, and you start to think about what these little cellular ideas are, what are going to be the building blocks of your score, what are going to be. So, and that's when you can start thinking about, for example, the folk tunes. Is there a folk tune that we can twist in some way to become the building block? And in fact, that did happen.
So a moment would occur and then I would improvise an idea from the store I carry with me of songs, and we'd then find if it sat in the moment. And if it didn't, I'd try another one, or maybe there'd be an adjustment from how the actors were behaving or whatever. And by, the songs were slowly inserted into the show.
And he would come up with something and it would either stick or it wouldn't. But it was, we felt, the kind of spirit of the village. The villagers would be able to join in that song, and we quickly realised that there would be a character who we called the song man, who would be, if you like, the living spirit of the village, and who would lead the songs.
The band is something that really straddles both the folk world in the play, because they are members of the village and they're all playing musical instruments. And in fact, that was one thing that John Tams was able to give us some very valuable insights into, you know, what kind of instruments would they have played, what sort of thing would they have played, and in what circumstances would they have played, and when would they have joined in, and so on. And that, the fact that we've got a band there, well, they are also the band that assists in playing the underscore. So that's a nice way of tying the two worlds together.
We tried to achieve a very broad cinematic approach to the show, broad landscapes, and my job is to complete the picture for the audience, if you like, where the set designer, video designer and lighting designer would create the visual landscape of any particular scene. I complete the picture by adding sound to that, so that for the pastoral scenes, for instance, where you have a projection of fields and trees, but an otherwise bare stage, I complete the picture by adding the sounds that one would expect to hear in Devon in 1912. And then we go into the war, for which I did a lot of research about the sound of the time. There isn't much archive recording of the First World War, but there is extensive archive recording of subsequent wars. And really what we're trying to get at with War Horse is not necessarily being ultra faithful to the First World War, but to create the emotional impact of being in the middle of a war.
What's very strong about the content of War Horse is an extraordinary degree of empathy, which it demands that you feel, and it creates in 1,000 people watching it. And there's some strong correlative between the ability of an audience member to invest a bit of cane and gauze with the life of a horse, and what it does almost neurologically in their head to their ability to extend their own empathy. So whilst ostensibly the message of the piece is almost sentimental, actually I think what's going on is considerably more complicated in an emotional sense. I think the National Theatre is the only place that this could have gone on at, that would have spent the time developing it and would have the resources and would not seek to make the kind of budget allocations and have tried to trammel it within financial parameters in which it would fail. It's not a lack of discipline, far from it. It's a kind of proper rigour about where we spend our money. And it's something that the British theatre has pretty uniquely, actually, in the world, this ability to experiment and to yoke people together with a sense of kind of common purpose.
I think what I've learnt from this production, more than any other, is this extraordinary way that everyone involved in it, from the lighting, to the design, to the direction, to the script writing, to the acting, to the music, everything, everyone, it seems to me, has somehow joined together to make this thing work. And it reminded me, when I went on stage for my debut on the stage, age 65, loved it. But what I learned from that evening was that everyone, whoever it is, behind the scenes, pulling whatever switch, doing whatever, is as important as everyone else in the making of this show. And they all know that. And there was a togetherness about the whole thing, which I found moving and enormously telling. It's why the production works. It's because when those people come together to make that show, they put heart and soul into it. They believe in it, they make it. Unbelievable hard work, because I watched them. I watched these puppeteers sometimes, 3 of them together with no puppet around them, making all the movements, doing all the action, teaching each other of how it is to be a horse frightened, a horse worried. I just found it so telling that. And that infused the whole production for me, this togetherness. And that's what I came away after that evening. I thought, you know, what a bunch of people and what a show they've made together. And it's not about me or Tom Morris or Nick Stafford or Ray Smith or all the people. It's about this bunch of guys, and it was really nice to be one of them for one night anyway.
Easy, Joey. Easy now. Don't get excited. We'll get through this all right. Don't you worry.
Company! Advance!
We're taking up positions, sir. They've seen us.
We keep advancing, knee to knee.
Only the truth that in life we have spoken, only the seeds that in life we have sown, these will pass onwards when we are forgotten, only remembered for